Now, this has been very serious indeed. From where I'm sitting high up here in the press box, through the darkness and the fog, the ambulances are still there at that certain spot beneath the east terracing where I think a crash barrier gave way. I haven't been able to get that confirmed, but the ambulances are still going round the track. They're still taking away the spectators who have been injured. And from where I'm sitting here, I can see, well, what looks to me rather like bodies, I'm afraid, alongside the goalpost here at the east end of the park. The whole thing is very serious indeed, and even now they're still bringing them across the field on the stretchers. I believe beneath me here in the stand everything is turmoil. The kiss of life is being given. All available ambulances and police have been hurried here to Ibrox Stadium. It is indeed and has been a very, very serious accident indeed.
New Year bells had been ringing, all Scotland was singing. The old year had died and the new had been born, as the news of disaster from Ibrox came spreading, the news that would cause a whole nation to mourn.
Rangers Football Club is a name that resonates around the globe. But from their humble beginnings, the club's founding fathers could never have imagined how their club would grow to become an icon in world football. Over the years, the club has shaped the British game. Not only in the way they played, but the way it's watched as well. Rangers' influence knows no bounds. Their incredible, record-breaking achievements are celebrated the world over. But with unbridled joy comes tragedy, and in its history, Rangers have had to face more adversity than most. It has seen the darkest days and come through them. Stronger not only as a football club, but as a family, the Rangers family. Prior to 1971, the club had already faced tragedy on a large scale. It came on the 5th of April 1902 during the British Home Championship match between Scotland and England. The back of the newly built West Tribune stand collapsed due to heavy rainfall the previous night, causing hundreds of supporters to fall to the ground below. 25 people died. Over 500 were injured. The stand at the time consisted of wooden terracing supported by a steel girder frame. Following the accident, such frameworks were discredited and replaced throughout the United Kingdom by terracing supported by earthworks or reinforced concrete. Remedial improvements to Ibrox continued from 1902 until 1917, but it was not until 1929 that the next major redevelopment occurred, with the completion of the new main stand to the south of the ground on the 1st of January. Its designer was Archibald Leach. The imposing red brick facade provides a classic example of Leach's work, and the architectural significance of the Ibrox main stand is reflected in its status as a Category B listed building. With the main stand completed, the bowl-shaped ground was one of Britain's largest football stadia. Its appearance changing little for several decades, with the roof covers to the upper sections of the terracing being added in the 1960s. On the playing front, the club had enjoyed great success in the early part of that decade. But as the triumphant side began to break up, the club was overtaken by a resurgent Celtic under the guidance of Jock Stein. With few reasons to cheer, one would expect support to dwindle, but not the loyal Rangers fans. The team was always backed by a huge light blues support, and every Old Firm game meant Ibrox was packed to capacity. In season 1970-71, Rangers were struggling in the league. But the League Cup victory against Celtic at Hampden in October 1970, their first trophy in 4 years, meant that Rangers went into the New Year clash with their heads held high.
Steen and Derry Johnson out in front. He's there. Centre forward Johnston scores. A beautiful header from Willie Johnston's cross.
Well, there had been a resurgence in interest in the club when Willie Waddell took over. That was one of the important things. Although the team never really managed to get things moving in the league. And in 1970, in October, they won the League Cup, the first trophy in 4 years. So that was very important. It gave everybody a little stimulus, especially knowing it was against Celtic. So there was that element to it which was important for us. But as far as sustaining a league challenge is concerned, 1970-71 season was not great. Prior to the Old Firm match, in January 2nd, we'd lost 4 games. In the 6 weeks prior to that, we'd lost against Ayr United and Hibernian, Falkirk, St Johnstone, all games that you would be expecting to win, and these really left our chances of doing anything in the Championship in a tatters, really. It wouldn't matter if Rangers were at the bottom of the league and Celtic were top, or vice versa. The Old Firm game is always critical to the parties, even if it's a Glasgow Cup tie, even if it's a friendly. If you ever get these nowadays between the Old Firm, it was always going to be important, always critical to beat Celtic, and especially New Year, because the New Year was a time when people tended to get together. You look forward to that. That was a kind of iconic game of the season, was the New Year match, and it's one that everyone would have been really looking forward to. It was a new year, looking for a new start. And looking for a new start, certainly from a football point of view as well, Rangers were looking for one over on their rivals. I think the whole atmosphere of the tie was eerie. You know, it's probably easy to say that in hindsight, but it was eerie because the weather was misty, foggy is probably what you would call it. It was quite typical of Glasgow then, not so much nowadays, but you used to get a lot of fog hanging around, especially in the winter time. So it was one of these kind of calm days. Bit of fog, not a particularly nice day, but of course the fans who were making their way to the ground weren't really thinking about that. They were looking forward to the match. As it transpired, the match was not one of the greatest Old Firm games. There was no real tension in it other than what you would have normally. No issues really occurring in the pitch. You know, everyone seemed to be getting on pretty well. No harsh tackles. It seemed to be one of the kind of more neutral matches of an Old Firm type, you would say.
Like many who made their pilgrimage to Ibrox Park that day, lifelong supporter Ian Locke's experience has touched him forever.
Yeah, we travelled, I brought him partying, we travelled over with my friends in the subway to Colton Road, and we headed into the ground, and we normally go to the shed, the old shed, because that's we used to stand there between the halfway line and the 18-yard line. But by the time we got in, it was absolutely mobbed and jam-packed. So we took a position in the ground that we very, very seldom stood at, which was halfway down the terrace and behind the goals. And obviously the game started, and it was pretty a non-eventful game. You know, if anybody could ask me what happened that day, I can't remember a thing about it apart from the 2 goals. You know, as you know, and both the goals were scored in the last minute of the game, and even without seeing it in the TV since the goals, I can remember Johnson scored for Celtic, and I knew there was only minutes left. But lo and behold, Colin Sean got equalised, and we're absolutely delighted that we'd drawn the game. And we then headed up the terrace, and when you get to the top of the terrace behind the goal, there was quite a large concourse because they built a cover about 3 years prior at the Colton Road end. And you could either turn right, go down Emerson Drive, or go left. Because we were going to the subway station, we went left, and we started to shuffle our way towards passageway 13. And I always remember, I think to myself, it's quite tight. Well, it seems quite tight today, but you felt that a lot of times in the big games at Ibrox or Hampden.
There was always a problem in that staircase, and all the steep staircases in fact, because there was just so much crushing at the top of the stair before you even got there. What I remember about it was you just had no control of what was happening. So you would tend to work your way up to the back of the stadium after the game. You know, it may take a few minutes after the final whistle to get to the top of the staircase, but when you actually got to the top of it, there was so much crushing. And then what tended to happen was, as you were kind of carried forward towards the staircase, and that's essentially how it was, as you were carried forward, you had no concept of where the stair was, because you couldn't see in front of you. All you saw was just mid-air. And then suddenly you came to the staircase and the ground just seemed to disappear from below you. And you were always conscious that was going to happen, but you never knew whether you were a yard away from it or whether you were 5 yards away from it. You know, just kind of carried. And then suddenly you were just propelled down. Now, this was not a one-off. This happened in every match. So whenever you got to that, there was always a degree of trepidation that once you got there, if you went down, you had no chance. I mean, it really was, you know, that's how you felt. And so there was always a kind of sense of relief when you actually got down the staircase and it started to open up and things started to you know, get a little bit more space around you. I think there was a cult, certainly around standing areas at that time in football grounds. There was a culture of disorganisation, especially for big matches. And to be honest, the big matches were great because you had lots of people around about you. There was a swaying of the crowd, whatever. If there was a goal scored, you could end up in a place 10 yards away from where you started off, you know, prior to the goal. That was the beauty of it. In reality, it was not a safe environment for anybody. So I think when you got to the top of the staircase, that was what you expected in a big crowd. And there were other places like that too. I mean, Celtic Park was like that, Hampden was like that too. You know, it did happen in other grounds, but particularly at Ibrox and Stairway 13, it was very, very steep.
Well, halfway down, there must be a young boy threw his coat up in the air. As that came down, of course, the little boy was tripped and he fell down. Of course, one after another, they all came down, piled up and piled up. They didn't know who to go to first. There were so many of them. Then you looked out onto this brae here. It was littered with people moaning and people shouting for help. Then the other police come around here. They got this thing organised within a matter of minutes. No one could have done more than what the police did.
My father's advice, you know, in years gone by in these big games, that always keep your elbows up. Don't get pinned, don't get your arms pinned by your side. And then before you knew it, we were out the end of the concourse and facing down 13 and knowing that this wasn't the norm. And because of the crowd coming up off the terrace and the crowd coming from behind, nobody sees what's happening in front of them. So there's thousands of people pushing up, and all I can describe it as is a pack of cards. You know, that somebody had fallen, you know, somebody down the slopes, and the pressure was getting unbearable, and people were shouting, "Get back, get back!" But you know, people didn't see it, didn't realise how much folded in front of them. And before you knew it, as if your life was getting pushed out of you. You couldn't even shout, get back," because you were gasping for air. You know, the pressure in your body and your lungs was unbelievable. And then there was a bit of give in the bottom of the pack, and because my arms were still up, my legs were wrapped around somebody behind me, and I managed to squeeze my way out of the people in front, the people in back, and crawl over. There's a wooden fence that kept everybody as in a pen, and I managed to crawl over the wooden fence onto the grass embankment and down. Actually went outside the ground, but I was in a daze. It became clear very, very soon after the final whistle to many people. The press guys, by all accounts, saw almost
You know, as soon as, well, not as soon as the final whistle, but they started to see things happening at the top of the staircase. Some of the press guys ran across the stadium across the pitch to see what was unfolding. Police obviously trying to attend to things at the top of the staircase and at the bottom. But I think one of the strange things about it is that there were even people who came down that staircase that day, probably at the same time, who were completely unaware of what had unfolded.
When I got down the slopes, I'd lost my shoes and my breathing was away, and I felt my ribs was ready to pack in, and an ambulance grabbed a hold of me and took me into Ibrox itself. I think went into the boot room, and they checked me over and gave me a pair of training shoes, and that was me heading home.
It's what a pity that such a fine game between such two sporting teams should end this way, but it all happened so suddenly, just when the crowd were all going away. And in fact, I had my head down, my attention was suddenly drawn to the crowd up at the top of the North Terracing. It was obvious something serious had happened, and the police went over, and in no time at all there were ambulances, and you could hear the sirens outside, and then they came right onto the field here, round the track, and this long procession started out of the East Terracing, stretcher bearers running with the spectators on the stretchers into the tunnel. It has been pandemonium beneath us here, and I have no doubt everything possible is being done, but the latest report I have had is that it is and has been a very, very serious accident indeed, and there's just no saying how many fatalities there may have been.
The thing that struck me about the whole disaster is the impact it's had on the people here. You know, their whole demeanour changes when they talk about it. I would say that the two guys in particular who seemed to be most badly affected were John Gregg and Sandy Jardine, because they were right at the heart of it.
I remember the game. It wasn't a great game. It was 1-1. Celtic scored in the 89th minute. We went up the park and scored, and then they centred the ball and the referee blew the whistle. So we were coming off the park. A draw keeps everybody happy.
We were quite pleased with ourselves that we had rescued the game, or rescued the result by scoring so late in the game. After a lot of people thought that was the game over, it 1-0. So we went back into the dressing room after the match feeling quite pleased with ourselves. And it wasn't till, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 minutes after that we could see some of the staff whispering to each other, the manager and Willie Waddle looked to be quite agitated about something, that we realised there might have been something happened.
And we were in the dressing room, and probably about 10 minutes in the bath when somebody came in and said, you'll need to get out of the dressing room, but never gave us a reason why. And then about 5 minutes later says, come on, there's been an accident, you'll need to get out. So as soon as that happened, we started to get ready quickly. And I was one of the last ones out, and I remember being in the dressing room when they started to bring injured people into the dressing room and lay them along the floor.
I personally was, I don't know if I think I was injured or something and got some treatment, or when I came in back into the dressing room from the showers, they were starting to bring one or two bodies into the dressing room, and they were saying, come on, hurry up, you better get out of here, you know, it's not going to be a pleasant sight. And it was then that I realised there must have been something really bad happened. I didn't know if they were dead or alive. My first reaction would probably have been that they'd been hurt, and they were going to try and give them some treatment or something in the dressing room. And on my way out the ground, I went back down the tunnel and had a look, and the ambulances were flying about, and first aid people, police, and there was some bodies lying along the touchline. And I knew then that it was really, really bad.
And it was really strange because a kind of mist had came down, very, very misty, but you could see all the bodies laid out behind the goals, all the ambulances, and a lot of activity. And that's when you knew that at that time there was 8 people had died, lost their life. And I was travelling back to Edinburgh, but the time I got back to Edinburgh then it had went up to 66.
It wasn't till later on that night, because there was no mobile phones in those days, but it wasn't till later on that night that I think it was either the radio or the television broadcasted the news, and we realised how bad it was.
Because it was a strange thing. You go into a bubble. That's the only way I can describe this. You're into a bubble, and as if nobody else is there. And I always remember heading home. I stayed in the Broomhill Flats in Partick, and back in the subway again. And I can always remember sitting in the subway, and not a word was spoken. Nobody ever said. Nobody could talk about it. There was nothing spoken. And I went with two mates, Billy and George Todd, and they stayed in Merklin Street where it went off. And I walked right by their close. I went to the game with them, and I walked by their close, thinking how they got on, because you were just, I think it's really a state of shock you were in.
I was probably one of the lucky ones, whereby I was in the dressing room, and I went out to my friend's car and got taken back to Edinburgh, where I lived at that particular time. I didn't have to go out exit the ground and try and get home.
I was walking on the Baton Road to head up to home, and an old boy came up and said to me, "Look, son, I think you better get up the road." It's not that you get into the house, it must have been hours after it. And you see it all coming up on the TV, it was 13, then up to 23, and so much up to 66, and you realise, my goodness, what happened there?
Some of the people I've spoken to, there's been some horrific stories they've told me, and a number of people haven't been back to this ground since, and I can understand that as well.
I can always remember seeing all the players were involved and going to the funerals and representing the club, and that was a great thing for the club and the players to do.
I was 22, just turned 22. It had a huge effect, a very dramatic effect. And it wasn't so much it was when you went to the funerals. What the players happened is that we got called in on the Monday morning, and Willie Waddell was fantastic for the club. He organised everything. He's basically told us what would happen. He's told us that we would get into small groups, and the players would there'd be a representative of the club at every funeral, but also we would go and see all the people in the hospitals. But it really hit home when you went to some of the young funerals. Some young people, a lot of young people died. Usually when somebody's 70 or 80 and they die, it's a celebration in their life. But to go so young, that's when it really hit home, and it was very difficult.
Every loss was heartbreaking, every passing mourned. But the grief of not only the Rangers family, but the nation was never felt so strongly than in the small village of Markinch in Fife. 5 teenagers had all left the New Year's game and never returned. 5 young men who went to school together, cut down so early in life. The impact of this disaster was spread far and wide around the world.
The directors of Rangers Football Club expressed their deep sorrow and heartfelt sympathy for the bereaved relatives of those who lost their lives and for those who were injured at Ibrox Stadium on Saturday.
I think the club was very, very fortunate to have a man like Willie Waddell in charge. He made sure everything was done right, and very proper in the way he went about it.
Willie Waddell did a magnificent job at that time, because he must have had so much else on his plate as well. But he was magnificent in organising the players to go to as many funerals as possible. The big problem being that some of the funerals overlapped each other or were on at the same time in different places. But we went to as many funerals as possible to try and pay our respects to the families.
I think, when you get to a situation where you're seeing a ground transformed from a sports stadium into something else, that's not just, it's, I was going to say unique, it's happened in other grounds as well, of course, but I think particularly for the people that were involved, they weren't used to that kind of thing, so to actually have a situation where players were in the dressing room has happened, and to have some casualties brought through there, including some dead people and whatever, and taken to other parts of the ground as well. It was a case of anywhere where they could lay out bodies effectively. That's how it was on the day. But even apart from the day as well, the aftermath was just horrendous for them. I think it took months. I think if you speak to John Gregg and Alan MacDonald and Sandy Jardine and whatever, they'll tell you it's still not going away for them, really.
The heroes of that day were the men and women of the emergency services. However, little recognition has been given to the first aiders who were at the ground as the tragic events unfolded. The staff of the St Andrews Ambulance Service were the first to attend to the injured in the stadium, and to this day are still on hand at Ibrox, ensuring Rangers fans' safety.
Well, certainly their memories are always still vivid because we're here at most matches, and as you walk across in that area of the ground or even anywhere in the ground, you're always, memory takes you back to those sad days.
Well, I was the area officer at the opposite end, at the Broomwollen end, because we had our set areas. Although there's three of us here, Tom and Ian were there at that end. I was at the other end looking after the first aiders at that end. So in those days we didn't have radios or anything like that, so, and it was very misty, so you couldn't see down there, but you knew something was happening. So like anything like that, you send down a squad to see if they can assist, and then the word came back that it was major and everybody was down there to help out and see what they could do, and it was just a case of all hands to the pumps.
Well, I was actually stationed right down at the bottom corner, the corner of the field at the bottom of the stairwell, and we were directed up by the police officers, and by the time you fight your way up through the crowd, game's finished and everybody's wanting to get home, unaware of what's happening around them. And I'll certainly always remember just standing at the top of that stair, because we had no means of communication, and you just look down and it's a seething mass of people. And your first thought is just one of complete hopelessness. You hate to use that word adrenaline, but there's something that automatically says you need to get in here and do something. Considering that after the event, at that time, compared to now, our first aiders were totally unprepared for anything like that. They were probably inadequately trained and didn't have the proper equipment. Thankfully, things have changed now, but so in a sense it was, you were not awestruck by what was happening in front of you. You were saying, oh, well, I don't know what to do, but I'll have to do something. For the major, most of the people involved, the assistance was no longer required. There were very few minor injuries sustained on the day. These are the things that the first aiders could cope with. It was the major issues at the seat and in the stairwell. Similar to Hillsborough, people just died standing up.
As Tom says, at the initial stage you don't think about it. It was after you start thinking back, what could I have done? Could I have done something better? When I got home that night, it was 9 o'clock at night. I can remember saying to my father, throwing my uniform off, saying to him, take me down to the pub, down beside my mates, and I ended up drunk that night. But it did affect you. Talk about post-traumatic stress. At that time, wasn't really thought about, but yes, thinking back now, it did affect me at that time. Walking along a goal line, where all the bodies had been laid out, and just seeing people lying there. At that time, you knew nothing you could do for these people. They'd already been pronounced dead by the doctors, so it was a memory that always comes back to you.
Similar to Ian, standing, once all the people were away and it was a kind of tidy up, wash up of the operation, standing at the top of the terracing, at the top of the passageway, you looked down one way and it was just a mass of metal, always quiet. There was still was that mist and cold hanging in the air. There was piles of clothing, scarves, jackets, shoes, caps, tammies, the whole lot lying in a heap. And then if you turned the other way 380 degrees, as Ian says, you looked down onto the perimeter of the field, and there was neat loads of stretchers lying there, the people who had sacrificed themselves. And the other thing about it, and thankfully there was a great coming together between the two clubs over that period. When the call went out for extra assistance, when it became known that this was something big, the response from both club doctors and the club staffs, the two managers, were out there and they were working hand in hand together.
I can always remember a double-decker bus appearing and everybody getting out to assist. It was actually a Celtic supporters bus I'd seen. So everybody just gets towed around and helps as best they can at that time.
From the other aspect of it, as the other two were saying, was the thing that sticks in my mind with that was your helplessness that you couldn't do any more, but you were doing your best. And I also remember one instance of I think it was a youngster, where there was no hope for him, but we didn't have the skills to decide that. It's the doctor's got to decide that. And the father was saying, you keep trying, and you knew yourself that, there was nothing could be done, and you were just waiting for the doctor to turn around and say sorry. Occasionally, you have a flashback, especially when you come here on duty, as the three of us do. We're here regularly because we're 3 of the 6 duty officers that cover this ground. And as Tom has said previously, you pass that area and you think, about what happened all those years ago.
There's always something. I'll bring back a memory of that. That quite often when I'm outside, I walk by that corner and we look up at the plaque. It's in the wall in that corner.
2 of the greatest Scottish managers of our era attended Ibrox that fateful day, and both have been touched by what they experienced. Sir Alex Ferguson and Walter Smith faced Rangers on the park that season, but were both there at Ibrox to support the Light Blues.
Rangers and Celtic was always one of the biggest matches. I wasn't involved with Dundee United's squad over that holiday period, so my brother and I took the opportunity to go on a local supporters bus from Carmel to here, and looking forward to the game. So it was, from recollection, it was a tight enough match. Obviously, Celtic scoring through Jimmy Johnson in the 90th minute or so. After that, my brother and I, as most people, I don't mean most people try and do, we were trying to leave then, because obviously we thought, that was the game over at that stage. But Constantine managed to get a goal that I've never seen since. We were possibly about halfway down Stairway 13 at that stage of the Carmel end. We always come in to what was known as the Rangers end, and Stairway 13 was always the entrance and exit for us and for most of the people that were on the bus that travelled in that day. So I just remember, being on the stairway, and it starts to get congested, which wasn't surprising, having gone over the years. It was always tight, especially in the bigger games, and there was always a bottleneck at the bottom where people coming from the enclosure came down one side and we came down the stairs. I always remember just getting caught up in a kind of crush and stopping, and then all of a sudden falling over to the side, not actually falling over to the side, but getting over to the side aspect. And as I said, if I had gone to court afterwards, I would have said that my brother and I managed to scramble out over the fencing, which I thought had collapsed at the time. Years later, I picked up the Glasgow Herald one morning, and there was a picture of the empty staircase the day afterwards, and the fencing at the sides was still intact, where I thought I had collapsed at the side and we had managed to get out over the top. So goodness knows how we must have we scrambled our way up the fencing and over the top and down onto a grass banking, which was round the back there and out Edmonton Drive. So both of us managed to get out there. We went back to the supporters bus, and everyone got back in, and no one from the bus was affected. I just remember going back home, and in those days we didn't have obviously the instant media coverage that we have these days, and there was a crowd of people waiting at the corner in Carmel. Obviously the news of the deaths had got to the village, and they were all waiting to see that everyone was back.
We'd played Rangers the day before, and Big Jock rested about 7 players because he knew that Celtic game was going to be off that day, and the Celtic game was off against Clyde, and we played Rangers at Brockville, and we beat them 3-1, but Rangers had played a lot of young players, and we were to play Airdrie the next day,
right?
And our game was postponed, so I went dashed over to Ibrox to see the game with Andy Roxburgh, who was my fellow centre forward at Falkirk. Go in, saw old Bob the door, the front door, and got me a couple of tickets. Watched the game. We left 5 minutes to go. Well, ready with 5 minutes to go when Johnson scored. Jimmy Johnson scored, and then Colin Steen equalised, and we dashed off, and there was over the opposite Ibrox is the car park there. Made our way, and Andy lived in Ralston, so we went away up towards the Belson Park, cut round the back away from the crowds, and I dropped Andy off at Ralston, came back down by the Clyde side, by the Southern General Hospital, when I saw the ambulances going in. I said, Christ, there must have been some fighting. And then when I got home, my mother and father were, because Martin hadn't turned up, my brother was in the terracing, but he'd left early and he didn't know anything. He'd gone to the Rolls Royce Club. But eventually, hours later, he turned up. It was a bit fraught. Willie Thornton phoned us, I don't remember. He got a lot of the ex-players to go to certain funerals, which was very sad. There was a young girl from Falkirk. I went to the funeral with some of the Falkirk players, and a lot of the ex-players did great duties because there were so many funerals. I mean, it was a terrible time for Rangers, and I think it had an impact on Willie Waddle.
Some strength for the Rangers family was the impact the disaster had beyond the footballing world. This was not a city or a country's tragedy, but one that was felt around the globe.
I remember at the time the ripple effect right throughout the whole of Europe. You know, the amount of telegrams the club got from all over the world, it was astonishing. And as I say, it brought everybody together, particularly in Glasgow. And you'd have to say Celtic were, as a club, were very, very supportive. It was a trying time for everybody at this club, but Celtic, any request, they made sure they saw to it. And as I say, they were very supportive of the club and what was, in many ways, an hour of need.
Well, having been there as a Rangers supporter and then coming back with the club that I played for, at the time I hadn't been involved, obviously, in the New Year games, but came back there with a squad of players. It was indeed a very, very strange atmosphere. And like everything else, you don't remember that much about it. I think the overriding factor was, being the first team, first group of players to come back and play at Ibrox after that. So I like the game itself, the Rangers and Celtic game itself. I don't remember a great deal about that, and I don't remember a great deal about the Dundee United game either.
Again, it was an unreal atmosphere whereby trying to put that to one side while you got on with your job was very, very difficult. The place was very quiet. It was a very unusual atmosphere, but we just had to get on with it. And I'm quite sure that the poor people that passed away in that day would want us to go back and be as successful as we possibly could for their sake and all their friends.
As time went on, the questions began. Initially, the how and why of the tragedy was born out of speculation. Importantly, the official inquiry into the disaster brought an accurate account of the events that had unfolded on that dark day.
It's important from the point of view that, from a historical point of view, and also from Colin Steen's point of view, that for a long time he believed that he was responsible in some way for it. At the end of the day, I think you've got to say it happened. So it happened, and when it happened is almost a bit irrelevant. I think it was important to know the sequence of events. But the inquiry itself and various interviews showed that it did happen, so they say 4 or 5 minutes after the final whistle. It probably could have happened at any time. It could have happened 5 minutes before the final whistle, because at the end of the day it was all about a large number of people going down that staircase.
From that fateful day, what occurred on Stairway 13 changed the club forever. From the depths of despair came a new vision for Ibrox. A memorial that every Rangers fan could be proud of. A stadium that would change the face of British football. This vision was driven by one man, Willie Waddle, who vowed this type of disaster would never happen again at Ibrox and spearheaded the rising of a glorious football stadium.
He wanted to rebuild the ground in such a way that a repeat of that terrible tragedy wouldn't happen again.
And he was the instigator to really what is a memorial to the people that died, because a new Ibrox was built. He made sure we had the money. He went round and looked at various stadiums and came back with a plan. And although it was 3 or 4 years later, the foundation started to get built, until in 1982 we had probably the first all-seater stadium in Britain.
A beautiful example of a football stadium, Ibrox was once described as undoubtedly the best ground of its size in Britain. It truly is a great memorial to those who lost their lives that dreadful day.
So the stadium was a great testament to Willie Waddle and Rangers for what happened there. And it was only right that they should do something like that. And I sit in the Colton rear now, and I take my grandsons, and you're so relaxed, you know, about going to games now, and it's far from your mind now of what happened then, but obviously it's a testament to the 66 that died.
Such a good job he did of planning and making the stadium as it is, you see it, most of it today, was that the government brought out what they called the Taylor Report, and quite a number of the major clubs in Great Britain came to look at Ibrox to base their new grounds on the way that Willie Waddle had organised it here. And hopefully, I never see it in my lifetime. I hope we don't see it in the history of this football club again, something as bad as that.
The changes in the stadium fabric and the structures, the approaches to the ground have made that sort of incident a lot more remote, because it's designed for people leaving and entering. There are no stairs to climb other than internal stairs. But on the other hand, you don't want to ever sit back and just be complacent and say, well, we have a new stadium, we have good systems in place. Complacency is something we must push away. Ever alert to things that are happening, because anywhere where you have a mass of people, 50,000 in a match day, it's a tremendous thing.
Stairway 13 was always our entrance and exit, and that was where we stood most of the time we were there. So it wasn't unusual for a crush to happen. There was always a bottleneck at the bottom, as I mentioned. So it wasn't unusual for there. I don't really think that much about it. The first time I can ever remember, you know, like scrambling over fences and down the side, that was the only unusual aspect of it. But had no real indication at that time that the severity of the accident was in hand. So, no, we didn't really know about the severity of that until, you know, we got back to Carmel again. You know, I mean, for people that come to a football match and give up their life is not something that anybody wanted. So, you know. Well, for different things, and you always like to think that the stadium in itself is a monument to the people who unfortunately died that day, and always will be.
That is a memorial. I know we've got a memorial there with the names on the plaques and John, but the stadium is a memorial.
Over the decades, the club have paid tribute to those that lost their lives. As the new year comes around, the Rangers family pauses for contemplation in remembrance and respect for those who went to support Rangers on January the 2nd, 1971, and never returned home. On the 30th anniversary of the Ibrox disaster, the club unveiled a memorial to the victims of both tragedies, and with them thousands of fans paid their respects too.
Almighty God, our loving Father, as we have met here today to express our love for those at rest and at peace with you, and looked back at our time of trial, we also want to express our gratitude for all the individual acts of heroism that become true examples of faith, of character, and of service in times of tragedy. We think of the people who cared for others and the people who go on caring for others. For the managers and Rangers and directors of Rangers and Celtic who did what they could at that time to bring comfort. For the Rangers players whose visits to hospitals and attendance at funerals was a great encouragement. For those who simply cared and those who expressed their grief. Now we dedicate this memorial to be, for all people, a reminder, a symbol, a place of pilgrimage where they can come and express their love for others and feel close to those whom they love. Amen.
The John Gregg statue is now a poignant symbol at the stadium for fans to always remember the 66 who lost their lives. But the fans too have made great strides to make sure that the memory of those who died on that dark day will never be forgotten.
We started off going to sort of refurbish the memorial stone, and it just grew arms and legs. We decided we'd get a bench, we'd get some trees. We're honouring Nigel Pickup as well, and Margaret Ferguson, along with the 5 boys. And we got the bench put in, we got it dedicated. It's a tribute for 5 boys. The most important thing of this was we got the parents involved in it, and we spoke to them, and that wasn't easy to actually speak to somebody that had lost their son and we were in the disaster, but it was good that they turned around and they says that they were happy with what we were doing, so that made us happy as well.
2 great clubs touched by tragedy, that bond strengthened with the gesture by Graham Souness in 1989.
Graham Souness introduced a party of 50 youngsters from Liverpool to the capacity crowd, and there was no mistaking the warmth of their welcome. The Ibrox manager then handed over a cheque for £30,000 on behalf of Rangers Football Club to go towards the Hillsborough disaster appeal.
And now both sets of fans have come together in memory of those that have fallen in the name of supporting the clubs they love.
I know it was a terrible disaster that happened at Ibrox nearly 40 years ago. Terrible disaster that happened at Hillsborough, and that's what unites people, to lose our fans the way we did. And I think it's a lovely idea. I'm really, really pleased with this idea and this lovely flag that John McGivern, with the help of other friends, to do this on behalf of the Rangers fans and the Hillsborough families. I think it's wonderful.
There was a story covered recently about Nigel Pickup, who was the youngest person to die in the Ibrox disaster. He was 8-year-old and it was the first football match he'd ever attended, and he was from Liverpool. So that's when we decided to get the banner made. It's very important that our 2 clubs are brought together, because throughout the years Liverpool and Rangers have always had a strong friendship. We've both suffered in the stadium disasters, both at Hillsborough and at Ibrox, and it's very important that this is recognised, and hopefully by the production of this flag we can do that.
What struck me immediately was the bond between the people here and my fellow Rangers fans, albeit in very sad circumstances. But the 2 disasters seem to create that bond, and you know, it's very, very important, I think, for us as fans of the clubs, but also all football fans, to remember these instances, because a lot of the modernisation and a lot of the good things that we have now were born out of these tragedies. It tells me an awful lot about the nature and the spirit. You know, we all too quickly hear all the negative aspects of what football fans are about, and certainly at Rangers, you know, we've felt the sharp focus of that at times in the not too distant past. So I think it's great to come together, show that there is a common bond, and the caring, the attitude that people have got, and the fact that they are prepared to spend time paying tribute to, you know, our fans who sadly lost their lives.
As we again approach the anniversary of the 1971 Ibrox disaster, each and every Rangers fan all over the world will pause and perhaps shed a tear in memory of the fans who passed away on Stairway 13. The club will mark this occasion, as will the Rangers support. A family in the truest sense of the word, remembering together.
I think it's always essential that you do that. You do that for even for generations that have came after a disaster, just to remind them that, you know, things weren't always as they are nowadays, where they can come to a game it's safe, and you know, they have no problems, you know, like crowd-wise or anything like that. I think that is, you know, one of the more essential parts of doing that. But obviously, as I've said before, for people to come to a football match and lose their lives, not something that anyone would have wanted, and I think you have to commemorate that, and Rangers have done that over the years.
The respect I have for the supporters will always be the big thing in my life. I'm quite sure that the club itself will never forget them, and that is the reason why the 2nd of January is always a special day in my life, and it's a special day in this club's life.
New Year bells had been ringing, all Scotland was singing, the old year had died and the new had been born, as the news of disaster from Ibrox came spreading, the news that would cause a whole nation to mourn. 2 great goals had been scored in the last dying moments. Jimmy Johnston for Celtic, for Rangers Youngstein. Their supporters all cheered them with voices of thunder, unknowing what waited on staircase 13. 66 people died, some in flower of their manhood, when the fences gave way and the barriers bent. Seasoned Glasgow policemen, their faces all tear-stained, with brave efforts endeavoured far worse to prevent. All of Glasgow enjoined for the first time in history in the Glasgow cathedrals, no Billy, no Dan, but the old firm united to pray for the victims of a tragedy set in the memory of man. New Year bells had been ringing, all Scotland was singing, the old year had died and the new had been born, as the news of disaster from Ibrox came spreading, the news that would cause a whole nation